Hey, good evening, ladies and gentlemen. How's everyone tonight? Good. Thanks for coming out to join us tonight. What would it be like to swim in the oceans of Europa? And what would it feel like to climb Olympus Mons on Mars? And would it be possible for all of us to experience these journeys together? The goal of the Telexploration program is to make us better explorers by building immersive environments that feel like we're really there. By drawing together technologies from sources as unlikely as the video game industry and advancing the state of the art, in human-system interaction, we are working towards low-cost holodecks, not only for every NASA mission scientist, but for every person who longs to explore space with us. This presentation will describe our progress towards these ambitious goals, as well as the challenges that are ahead. Tonight's guest received his bachelor's and master's degrees in computer science from MIT, and a PhD in computer science from the University of Southern California. Today, he leads mission operations innovation at NASA's Jet Propulsion Laboratory. He is also the founder and lead of the JPL Operations Laboratory and the principal investigator for a variety of projects focused on the control of spacecraft and robots. Previously, he was a section manager, group supervisor, and lead for control tools on the Spirit, Opportunity, and Curiosity Mars rover missions. Ladies and gentlemen, please help me welcome tonight's guest, Dr. Jeff Norris.
Good evening, thank you. It's a real pleasure to come and talk tonight about a subject of great personal interest of mine. I'm quite passionate about this concept of using technologies that are finally coming together, I believe now, to enable not just scientists and engineers to be better explorers, but also to include the public in the journeys that we're taking right now within NASA. So the vision that I want to describe to you today, put simply, is based on this. This is how human beings explore the world. We are all gifted with an amazing innate ability to extract a great deal of information from an environment and understand it just by being present in it. Now, scientists and engineers like the ones that operate our missions build upon those innate abilities with a lot of specialized training and learning until they can read an environment like this like a book. In fact, I've heard geologists tell me before that every environment that they go and explore on Earth has a story to tell, and that their study of that environment is trying to learn what that story is. That gives me a little bit of a concern, though, when you consider that right now, we're asking many of these scientists and engineers to explore other planets like this, peering at little pictures on a flat computer screen, trying to piece together in their minds a complete model of this distant environment that they're trying to explore, understand, and study. This is very challenging to accomplish. Part of the reason why it's so challenging is all those wonderful innate abilities that I just talked about are actually working against you here because you're not accustomed to seeing the world in this way. The problem gets even a little bit worse when you consider that our missions are often operated by groups of scientists and engineers. So imagine all these different people, each forming their own mental model of an environment, each flawed in a different way, and then coming together and trying to discuss those mental models and come to a consensus about what we should do next. Very challenging. This is what I believe that we need. We need to surround our scientists and engineers in environments that allow their innate abilities and their training and learning to work in their advantage, to help them understand environments like Mars and other bodies in our solar system and beyond. We need to immerse them in these environments to make them better decision makers and better explorers. And I can think of a few people, perhaps some folks here today, who would like to join them there as well. So that's our goal. What's in the way? What's preventing us from building that right now? What are the challenges we have to deal with? Well, there are two that I'm going to focus on a lot this evening. The first one is pretty basic. It's distance. The places we want to explore are far away. Now, I'm going to focus a little bit on Mars tonight. That doesn't mean that what I'm talking about doesn't apply to other planets as well. We're just going to stick with Mars for most of our examples. So let's take Mars. Mars is between 40 and 400 million kilometers away from Earth, depending on the time of year, depending on where the planets are in their orbits. That translates to a one-way signal delay of 5 to 20 minutes. So a signal transmitted from Earth, from us, takes 5 to 20 minutes to reach the robot that we're trying to control on Mars. Now, this seems like an incredibly challenging problem. If you've ever had a conversation over a bad phone call overseas, then you maybe have experienced just a fraction of a second of time delay, and it's irritating, it's hard, the conversation starts to break down. This is far longer than that. In fact, it seems so long that at times people have suggested that the way to overcome it is to just move the people closer. So we'll leave the robot on Mars, but we'll put the human in orbit around Mars. And so by doing so, we'll have a time delay that's only going to be around a second or less. And I agree, this would be a great thing to have. It would certainly make those robots easier to control. However, this would also be extremely expensive to accomplish, and I believe unsustainable in the long term. I also don't think it is the best way that our astronauts can spend their time contributing to exploration. So let's come back to that 5 to 20 minute delay that seemed like such a barrier. I'm going to say instead that this seems like a luxuriously short amount of time to deal with. And here's why. Because today, when we operate rovers like Spirit, Opportunity rather, and Curiosity, we're really dealing with a much longer time delay, and here's why. We send commands to a robot like Opportunity typically once per day in the morning when the robot wakes up. The robot then spends its whole day executing all of those commands, taking pictures, driving places, things like that. And then at the end of its day, sends its information back to us. We then work all night, all the Martian night again, to send it a new set of commands on its following morning. And at that point, that's 24 hours later than our last transmission. So I will contend that we are not, in fact, dealing with a 5 to 20 minute time delay when we operate a robot on Mars today. We're, in fact, dealing with a 12-hour time delay because it's 24 hours between each of our transmissions. Interestingly, 12 hours is about how long it would take us to bounce our signal off of Pluto at its furthest distance from the sun and then back to Mars again. So this doesn't seem like the best way we could imagine operating a robot on Mars. How would we fix this? What would we do to correct this issue so that we could deal with only 5 to 20 minutes of time delay? Well, we know how to fix it. We need something approximating continuous or near continuous communication between Earth and Mars to fix this. We already have half the problem pretty much fixed in that we've already arrayed the antennas of the Deep Space Network at 3 locations around the Earth so that they can talk pretty much anywhere in space at any time. What we don't have on the other end is a telecom infrastructure to receive those signals and pass them on to surface spacecraft at any time of the day. So we need those. And if we had them, we could send signals pretty much anytime we wanted to anything in the Martian system. This would be revolutionary for Mars exploration. And I would assert that if we're trying to bring around that revolution in Mars exploration, that a change in our telecom infrastructure is the first, most modest, and I think biggest bang for our buck we could imagine. Why? Well, because it would allow us to start operating a robot in a very different way. So instead of sending a full day's worth of commands all at once, we could instead send a little bit of work for the robot to accomplish. We could say, drive a little bit of a ways, and then tell us what happened. And then drive a little bit further, take some pictures, and tell us what happened again. Now, because we're able to respond to things as they're developing, meaning we can see how far it got and change our mind about what we want to do, this would be a far more effective way to operate. But there is another problem that I'm hiding in here. This would be good, but we can do much better, and the research in my laboratory has been trying to make this kind of an operations model even better than this. So here's the problem. When you send that first command to the rover, first of all, we know we're already paying one time delay cost, right? It takes 5 to 20 minutes for that signal to get to Mars in the first place. What happens then, though? This human being starts to wait because we're waiting for the robot to do what it was told. So we wait while it completes those commands. We wait for it to send the results back another 5 to 20 minutes. And then what happens? Well, now the robot has to start waiting. because we have to think about what it's going to do next. So someone's always waiting. In fact, when the signal's in transit, both parties are waiting. So we spend a lot of time with one part of this very important partnership waiting. In fact, this method of operations has been come to known in the time delay operations world as bump and wait, because you bump the robot a little bit, and then you wait to see what happened. Bump it forward a little bit more and wait to see what happened. How can we get out of this? Where could we look for some inspiration? Well, turns out that video games got to deal with a very similar problem. And I'm going to explain how they deal with it, and then how we're following an impressively similar result. Now, many years ago, some friends of mine and I, just for a hobby, wrote a modification to a very popular video game of the time. And this is actually actual speed. It was a very fast-paced game. You know, explosions happening everywhere, rockets flying, lots of people running everywhere. It was a bit chaotic. And it's very challenging for a game like this to keep everything in sync, because people are playing from all over the country. And they need to all kind of have a consistent view of the world for this game to make any sense at all. Now, I'm not going to explain how we resolved it in this game, because it's a bit of a complicated game. I'm going to reduce it to something a little more simple and perhaps familiar to some folks in this audience. This is Pitfall Harry in the Atari 2600 game Pitfall. Very charming game, played in many, many living rooms, including some that I have been in. And the idea here is you run and jump and try to keep yourself safe. Now, when you're playing this by yourself in your living room, it's very easy for things to stay in sync, because there's really only one version of the world. It's the version that's being run on your Atari inside your living room. So that's easy. Imagine, though, if we were going to play a game like this across the internet. Suddenly, there's not one version of the game. There's actually two. There's one running on your computer, and then there's another one running on the server. And the server's job is a computer that's responsible for making sure that your version of the world and all of the other people who are playing with you stay consistent, and that certain rules are followed. Keeping these versions of the game in sync can be very challenging, and I'm going to explain why with a very, very simple example. So, simply running and trying to jump over that pit. Let's imagine that the server, that's that computer that's responsible for keeping things in sync between the players, has told us where Pitfall Harry is. And we've decided we'd like to run towards that pit. So we push the key in our computer that tells it to run, and we have to send a command to the server telling it that we want to run, because it's actually not okay for our computer to be completely in charge of what the world is like. Because if it were, it would be very easy to cheat. You could simply have your computer say, well, I can run 10 times as fast as everyone, jump 10 times as high, and I got all the points, I win. Right? It wouldn't make it very much fun for the other people. So what we have to do is basically request of the server that we want to run. So imagine that command starts heading its way towards the server. Now, the internet is fast, but it is not instantaneous. So if the computer that you're playing on were to wait around to hear back from the server saying, yes, you're running, then the game would be very stuttery, very jerky, very laggy to play. So instead, what your computer has to do is guess. It guesses, you know what, I'm just going to assume that the server is going to tell me it's okay, and so we're going to start running. And you know what, you're about to get into that pit, and you push the button that says jump. You still haven't heard anything from the server yet, and your character starts jumping and starts to grab onto that rope, and then finally the server gets back to you about that command that you said, I want to start running. So what are you supposed to do now? How do you stay in sync? Well, what happens is very, very quickly in your game on your local computer, it takes the information that the server gave it, rushes it back, and says, all right, what if this is the way that run actually turned down? And then it plays forward all the commands that you used on your local computer since then to get a new version of reality. And when that happens, small things might change. And in practice, those changes are small enough that you don't really notice them when you're playing a game. But your game, your local computer, is actually doing this over and over and over again very quickly, locally. It's receiving an updated piece of information from the server. It's running forward from there to what now is on your computer, and rendering a new version of now over and over again. You just don't realize it's doing this. And of course, this is happening on all of the computers. this dance continues when you're playing a game, and all modern online games work off of a system that is like this. Now, what does this mean for exploration? Well, they get to cheat a little bit here because in order to make the predictions pretty good, they actually run a copy of the code that the server has on your local computer. So it's kind of running through the same rule book to figure out what the server is likely to predict. Now, it can't predict everything because, for one thing, your computer can't predict the actions of other players. But it can get pretty good. Imagine now that what's on the other end of the time delay is Mars. It's not a computer, not a simulation. So we can't run Mars locally. We can't run a copy of that locally. So we have to make our best predictions, our best guesses about what's going to happen, but we're going to be wrong more often. We're going to have more uncertainty. So that comes to how the research in my lab is trying to address this particular challenge, because the concept of predicting what is going to happen in order to mitigate the effects of time delay is not new. But what we believe is new is providing a way to reason upon the uncertainty that that introduces. So a member of our lab, Alex Menzies, actually went so far as to write a video game version of what it would be like to drive a robot with time delay, and this is what it looks like. So let me explain a couple of things that you're seeing here. This black circular robot down here at the bottom, well, that is a robot, and the red thing is which way it's facing. And these green dots that are being laid up here at the top, those are waypoints. Those are places that you want the robot to go. These dark blue lines here, these are walls. These are things that you're not allowed to bump into. This blue haze that surrounds these waypoints is what we call the uncertainty volume. This represents how unsure you are about where the robot will actually end up if you tell it to go to those locations. And you'll notice it grows and shrinks. If you get way out in advance of the robot, which is down here, this is where you last heard the robot really was. If you get too far out in advance, that uncertainty volume gets too big, and you have to stop and wait for it to compress. Like right now, the driver is waiting until that blue uncertainty volume gets small enough that it can fit through that passageway there. So finally, right there, the driver can see, I have enough room to get through, so I will issue those waypoints, and the robot will start driving again. And then he'll start quickly adding waypoints to move up to the next passageway and have to stop again because now the uncertainty is getting a little bit too large again. Like we really need to wait again and let the real robot catch up. Now, why does that uncertainty volume get smaller when you wait? It's because as it gets closer to where you're planning, there are fewer and fewer ways that things can go wrong, that things can be unpredictable because it's close to where the waypoints are. So it's not going to instantly jump 10 feet to the left. It's going to make small errors as it drives. What we're trying to do is to allow a person to stay ahead of the robot while managing risk by understanding the uncertainty that introduces. There's one last thing I want to point out, which is this special orange little version of the robot here. That's something we call the committed state. The committed state is basically where you think the robot would be if you said, stop everything right now. So you can't stop the robot instantly on Mars because it takes 5 to 20 minutes for your stop message to get there. Where that orange little robot is where you would expect it to stop if that stop command were sent right now. What's also really important about it is if you can stay ahead of that little orange robot, then you're in fact not paying any penalty for the time delay. Because if you're dropping waypoints in front of this orange robot, it means that the robot will get that instruction before it stops. So this game becomes about, can you plan waypoints in front of the committed state while being very careful never to let your blue uncertainty volume intersect with something that you don't want to come into contact with. If you can do that, there's actually no difference between operating that robot 2 feet away or 400 million kilometers away. So let's look at how we've tried applying this to a real robot, because that's just a simulation. This robot is just a basic off-the-shelf robot that we've outfitted with some range sensors on top. And so those range sensors allow the robot to keep track of where things are in the environment in addition to what they look like. And we've set up a little obstacle course for it with those red boxes. So you can see the sensors up top, complete with googly eyes. So this is, remember, the old way, right? So we issue a waypoint and then we wait until the robot arrives at that spot. And when it gets there and tells us I've gotten there, then we put another waypoint and then we wait again. So that's bump and wait, right? So here is the interface that we've built that allows us to go beyond that. This is a rendering of the environment as sensed by those sensors on top of the robot. And then when we plan a path through this little obstacle course of red boxes, you'll see that uncertainty volume appear. And as we drop additional waypoints, we have to be careful if we ever see the blue hazy part come into contact with a box, because that would mean we might crash, we might bump into something. So that situation you see right there is not good. You'd have to pull that waypoint back a little bit. And that ghosted robot you saw on the interface, and we're giving you just an idea of what it would look like if it existed in real life, that's that magical state called the committed state, that if you're planning in front of that, you're not paying any penalty for time delay. So we've had some encouraging results with this interface. We're about to start some experiments where we hope we'll be able to show some quantitative benefits to people who choose to drive robots this way instead of the old way. What would it enable if we could drive a robot that way on Mars? Well, you saw what it looked like with bump and wait. You saw what it looked like when you just kept, when you had shorter bump and waits, right? When you give it just a few things to do and then a few more things to do. If we could drive it the way that I just showed you, it would be more like this. We would send commands to tell the robot to move. It would be reporting back to us about how things are happening, and we would be passing out new waypoints to it kind of right in front of it. Far enough out where we're managing our uncertainty so that we're not doing anything dangerous, but still we're trying to keep the robot from sitting idle and waiting for a command. This would be a dramatic benefit to operations and to exploration, because it would allow us to not only react quickly to things as they're changing, meaning that you could drive a little bit, see what you see, and then choose where to drive, or take a big picture at low resolution and then pick an area to take a higher resolution interactively right then. But it would also allow us to manage the risks associated with getting too far ahead. So I'm going to go on to something else now. Distance was one of the barriers in front of the Telexploration project. Immersion is another challenge. What do we do with the information that comes back from these robots when we're controlling them? How do we present it to the people who are responsible for driving them so that they have an intuitive understanding of the environment of the robot and can make good decisions about how to drive it? Imagine yourself as a Mars scientist who's trying to help control the Curiosity rover. You are inundated with a torrent of imagery and other data. You're trying to put together a mental model of the scene around the robot. We've come up with some tools to help ourselves do this. We build maps. We take the pictures and we stitch them together into larger pictures, and then we reproject them from interesting angles to try to get it all in our head about what the scene really looks like. Sometimes we put the robot as a 3D model into a scene in a computer and then fly around it to try to understand where the terrain is and how big the robot is relative to some of the things in it. But we spend quite a lot of time looking at images like this. This is a panorama, one of my favorites, acquired by the Spirit rover around 1,000 days into its mission. I want you to study it with me for a moment. Try to get a feeling for this environment that the rover is exploring. Now try to imagine yourself as an astronaut there with it. Perhaps you've come over here to study a rock that looks interesting over there, and you decide that you'd like to go to another place, perhaps over there where there's a patch of soil that looks interesting. Look at this picture and tell me how you would get there. It seems reasonable that you would just follow that path. It seems very reasonable but incorrect, because if you were there, people would probably start laughing at you because you would have turned around and walked directly away from where you wanted to go, because this is a panoramic image. This is the fastest way to get from point A to point B. Much faster, in fact. Those spots are only a few feet apart. And although those little silhouettes look kind of reasonable right now, if you really were standing there on Mars studying that rock, you wouldn't be that big, you'd be that big. And unless you grew to about 20 feet tall while you walked, you'd be that big over on the other side. I tried very hard to make these measurements. It's even hard to produce an accurate size when you're working with data that's only rendered this way. Now, when you first looked at that image, you probably didn't see anything that looked peculiar. It probably looked normal. It probably looked like something you would just see outside your window if you were sitting there on Mars. If I had shown you a picture of something a little more familiar like this, which, by the way, is the exact same kind of image, you would have instantly noticed that there was something a little bit odd because you've seen cities, and they don't usually look like this. Now, let me ask you a question, a little quiz. If you're there and you want to go there, how would you do it? And I'm going to pause for a second and let you think about it. How do you get from the arrow on the right to the arrow that's kind of in the middle there? What's the path that you would take? Where would you have to turn? How would you walk there? Okay, it's a trick question. You would walk in a straight line. It is on the same street. You would walk directly down the street, not turn at all, and you would arrive immediately at your destination. And if you were there, you would certainly do just that. How about an inside environment like this? This is the United Nations General Assembly room. If you want to walk from that aisle over to that aisle, no, it's the same aisle, same trick, right? It is, really. If you can see the footpath down across the bottom there. See that little curve? Well trodden by diplomats. When we see things that are familiar to us projected this way, we immediately recognize that they're not an accurate representation of the way the world really is. They're still challenging to interpret even when we do know. Even if you know that this room actually looks like that, it's still really hard to try to map those things to each other. It gets even worse if things are moving. Good thing we don't do extreme sports this way, right? Watch your friend in the red jacket here. Does that make sense? It does not help if you stand still. That's pretty peculiar. What's going on here? The bottom line is that we are not evolved or taught to view and understand the world this way. And even with great mental effort, we cannot enforce a model of the world that makes sense on the data that looks like that. It's just too hard. So what are we going to do about it? How can we show things to people? What kind of an environment can you put them in that would make them feel a little bit more like they're there? Who could we ask about this? Video games again. So I wish I could tell you that this was a video of me, out snowboarding. Although I hope there's no one in this audience that snowboards this way. I've forgotten the name of this snowboarding game, but I put it here to make a point, which is that the video game industry is all about immersion. It's about trying to make you feel like you're in a place that either doesn't exist or a place that you would never go in your right mind and imbue you with powers that you would never have in those environments. I'll also point out that they build immersion with a budget that far exceeds all of the world's space exploration budgets combined. No joke. So, they don't only do it with cool renderings like that. They also do it with amazing devices. So here are just a few examples of investments of many millions into usability and human interaction. Controllers that sort of just beg to be held, head-mounted displays, body tracking systems, motion tracking systems. These are all tools to try to make you feel more like you're in the game. Okay, so you may be looking at this and saying, gimmicks, these don't really make that big of a difference. Well, I'm going to make a pretty impassioned argument to the contrary, starting with just a very simple example. If you don't like roller coasters, you might want to close your eyes for just a second, because we're going to go on a little bit of a ride. There's nothing really magical here. We've just stuck a camera on the front of a roller coaster here, and we're going to see what it feels like to go down this. Now,
all right, here we go.
Let me ask you a question. Do you feel something? Do you feel a little more now? Why? You're sitting in an auditorium. You're looking at a screen that's 30, 40 feet away from some of you. Why does it feel like you might be moving? Why did it feel more like you were moving when I made it just a little bit bigger? This is first in a number of examples I'm going to give. that I would say are just sort of a little bit of a funny proof of the fact that we are a little more simple than any of us really want to believe. Just by covering a little bit more of your retina and making things go rush past you like that, you get a little feeling in your stomach like you might be moving. Now let's take this a step further. What if you take a person who's a little bit afraid of roller coasters and you put them inside a head-mounted display in which they ride a roller coaster virtually? This is what happens.
No! Leave it on, leave it on.
Oh, that's awful. Oh my gosh. I'm right here. I'm right here. Right here, Grandpa.
Saying, "I'm right here, Mom," is what he's saying. I don't want to play anymore, he just said. It's great to have friends. Listen.
Get this off me, get.
He's hyperventilating at the end, okay? So, we can wonder whether it was really particularly kind of his friends to put him through that. But let's take a look here. These are grown adults. They know where they are. They know that they're sitting in a chair in their home. They know that just 30 seconds ago they were talking with their friends. Why are they reacting this way? Why are they scared of something that they know isn't a roller coaster? Again, I think it's because we're a little more simple than any of us want to really think that we are. Let's look at one other example, continuing with the theme of terror. Here is a scary game played by more grown adults who are used to scary movies and scary video games. All that's going to happen is that girl's going to disappear.
Oh boy. I don't want to be in here. I don't want to be in here anymore, man.
I don't want to be in here anymore, is what he said.
Oh my God. Dude, no. Okay.
Just, I'm okay.
No. I'm done. I'm done.
All right. I love these examples. How can grown men be terrified of a video game like this? Well, incidentally, this last person here wrote in his comments on his YouTube video that this was the most terrifying video game, movie, book, whatever experience that he'd ever had in his life. There's some critical things that are happening here. Complete isolation of the visual field of the player. Audio, three-dimensional isolation of their ears as well. There are factors here working together to make these people willing to accept the environment that they're being presented with. This is what immersion looks like. And here it's being used for entertainment, to scare, to shock. How can we use it for exploration? I'm going to contend that when you accomplish this kind of immersion, you are making it possible for humans to use those innate abilities that I was talking about at the beginning of the talk. So I'm going to give you a few examples here of how my lab is using these kinds of technologies. Okay. So what I have here is an Oculus Rift. It is a head-mounted display in active development right now by a team in Long Beach. We've been partnering with them for some time. You may have seen some of them on the internet. It's a couple of screens placed very close to your eyes with optics in front of them and a device in here that is keeping track of which way it's facing. So as I turn it, I've got a scene that was taken shortly after Curiosity's landing up there. So if I put this on my face here, I also see it in stereo. So that means that I'm getting a different version on my left eye than my right eye, and it helps me to sense how far things are away. I can actually go to a few other places on Mars here. And I want to talk about what happens in a system like this. Because the motion of my neck is consistent with what I'm seeing on the screens. This sense of which way I'm turning my head, it's often called the kinesthetic or somatosensory sense. It's the part of our brain that's responsible for knowing where our body is. When you synchronize that sense with what's coming into your eyes, your brain immediately takes a jump in how it can put an environment like this together. Just by doing that. I want to show you one thing it doesn't do. Remember this, because I'll give you an example later about how we're dealing with it. So I can turn. It keeps track of which way it's facing. But if I slide it, hard to hold it still enough, nothing changes. So it's not actually keeping track of its position. It's keeping track of its orientation. Okay? What's the next step? We've got our eyes agreeing with our neck, our body. But we're not able to move around in the environment. We're only able to control which way we're facing. So the next demonstration I'm going to show you allows us to start moving around, although in a basic way, in a different environment. Okay, give a second for this data to load in. The data that you're going to see here is all acquired from the Mars Reconnaissance Orbiter. So it's going to look a little bit blurry, but it's real data of Mars. And I'm going to put on this headset, and I'm going to really put it on this time because I need to be able to move around. The way I'm going to move around is with this joystick, this gamepad. So I can look and see things in different directions just like I could before, but now I can also move. So I'm going to move over here to where we have the Curiosity rover waiting for me. Looking around, it's like a nice place. This is in Gale Crater, incidentally. This is in Curiosity's landing site, although it's not currently located right here. And I can look around this robot now in different directions, from different directions. Because I'm using this gamepad here to pick where I'm standing, and then I'm using my gaze direction, just checking, to decide where I'm looking. So I can, get up here and take a close look at the mast. Now, what happened there? You see me trying to slide my head again? Nothing's happening, right? Because again, it's tracking the direction that I'm looking, but not the position. The only position control I have is here. There's another problem, though, which is that you and I do not move through the world using a thumbstick. We walk. So another thing that's kind of interesting about this is that I find moving around in an environment wearing a head-mounted display using a controller like this fairly disorienting. And the reason why is that the motion of my virtual body is not in sync with what I'm seeing on the goggles anymore. So remember that kinesthetic sense I was talking about, when the neck and what you see in your eyes is in sync? Well, all of a sudden now, what I'm seeing in my eyes is out of sync with my body because my kinesthetic sense says you are standing still. Your legs are not moving, but the scene is moving. This is why sometimes people get motion sick in a situation like this, because actually what your brain is saying is, this does not make sense, and I think you may have ingested some kind of poison, which is making you hallucinogenic, and so maybe it should all come out of your stomach now, which is why you start to feel sick to your stomach. So we don't want that to happen, of course. So what could we do instead? Well, we could allow ourselves to move around by walking. This is an omnidirectional treadmill called the Virtuix Omni. And it was in our lab recently, and that's Brian Duran, one of the members of our lab, walking around in that same scene that I was just in. So the Omni is kind of interesting. It accomplishes this feat by really being a carefully engineered slippery bowl. It's really that. So you wear special shoes, and when you step outside the center, you kind of slide back towards the middle. I'll show it to you here again in a second. So there's nothing, no motors or anything down there. You're just sliding back to the center. And you're balancing yourself a little bit on that waistband thing because it's sort of slippery. You can also wear a belt that will keep you supported on that ring that's around your waist. If you use a system like this one, I think that you would find that that effect I was talking about moving around with a joystick is less. Because now the scene moves when your body moves. So as you walk, the scene moves as if you're walking. And your body feels your legs moving and sees the scene moving. So less of that discontinuity, where your brain says this doesn't make sense. We still don't have the position of the head though, right? Turns out that the position of the head is really, really important. You're using it right now. You may not really realize it, but you're pretty much spending your whole life going like this. And by doing this, you can start to get a feeling for how far things are away, how much room there is. Could you fit through there? Could you make it out that door or something like that? So here's what we can do to start also tracking the head. This is Victor Luell, another member of our lab. He's got the Oculus Rift on again, but we're tracking it with these little markers, which are observed by these cameras. It's a Vicon Bonita system. Same sort of like motion capture system that they use in movies for character animation. So using that, we can not only keep track of which way the display is facing, but also where the display is within that space. So we've also dialed up the detail quite a lot here. We're also including the surface detail in addition to orbital information, all blended in with pictures taken by the robot as well. So when Victor stands up, looks around, when he starts walking in this environment, as he's going to do right here, the scene changes as if he's walking around in that same spot on Mars. He can crouch down and take a new perspective on the scene, study a wheel. He can use that head parallax that I was talking about, moving your head back and forth, to get a feeling for how are those things really situated in the environment. How big are they? How much room is there in between them? He can really start to sort of feel how large things are in the environment that he's been asked to explore. So let's review those three ingredients we put together there. We connected what you see with the direction you're facing, with where your neck is pointing. We made it possible for you to move by walking. And we kept track of your point of view by tracking the position of your head. Those three ingredients turn out to be a really, really great combination. And although this system is still early, and we still have more research to do, and we have some studies that we're going to be doing, testing the efficacy of this, comparing it with other means of trying to understand an environment that's being explored, we're very encouraged by the results that we're seeing so far. I'm really looking forward to sharing this one with more of you soon. I wish I could bring all of you up here right now and let you all try this out right now. And believe me, in my hopes, what we're on is a path towards where these kinds of technologies are going to make it possible for all of us to experience that. But I wanted to give you a little bit of taste of it tonight. So I love doing live demos in my talks. And so I'm going to try to do something even a little crazier here, which is that I'm going to try to do a demo that involves all of you right now and everybody out there who's watching online. So if you'll pull out your phone right now, yes, I'm actually telling you at a talk to pull out your phone, which I know is a little bit rare, a little bit out of the ordinary. Type in that URL that's at the top into the browser. Now, I should warn you that if you have an iPhone 4 or 5, this is going to work really well. If you have an Android phone, it may not work quite as well. Turns out that different phones have a different amount of noise in the gyroscope, which is keeping track of which way the phone is facing. So if it starts to get really jittery and shaky on you, first of all, make sure that you've turned your phone this way and that you're holding it sort of like you would if you were taking a picture. By the way, stand up, because it's a lot easier when you can look around behind you and look around this environment. If you're having troubles with your phone, borrow your neighbor's. So turn it sideways like this. And then move your phone around as if you were sort of taking a picture. And as you turn around, it's going to change your perspective. And it should give you just a little taste of what I'm talking about here. It's the same panorama that I challenged you with those questions about early on in the presentation. The one where I was asking you which way you would walk, it's the same panorama shown down here at the bottom. If you look down, you'll see the rover underneath. if you look, try to find the rover tracks in the environment. You can look and see the hills out in the distance. And then I want you to try and mentally extend how this feels with how it would feel with even more technology. Because really, this is a cheap little trick. This is a tiny little technological trick. Imagine what is possible with more technology, with more efforts put into immersion. So here's what gets me kind of excited about this. Because I would believe that right now, all of us in this room and the people who are watching online are standing on Mars together. And that we're exploring this place together. And it's my hope that when we come to a day, like the day when we first put an astronaut's boot on that planet, that there are going to be 1 billion people in attendance for that event. That they're going to be standing beside them, standing beside each other, and alongside that astronaut on Mars. I hope to see you all there, and I thank you very much for your attention this evening. Thanks. And I've left time for questions, so I'm happy to take them. I'm supposed to remind you that if you have a question, to please come to this microphone here so that everybody can hear the question as well as the people who are watching online. And I'll leave this running for a while, don't worry.
At the beginning, you showed the projection of the model vehicle ahead and the uncertainty cloud.
Yes.
How accurately can you actually calculate where the boundaries of that uncertainty cloud are, and how do you do that?
So it's challenging, of course. We make models of the robot and how it performs in the kind of terrain that we're driving in. And those models are, actually there are large groups at JPL that are devoted to that challenge of simulating and modeling the interactions of robots with surfaces, with wheels on dirt and how they react. So the answer is we do our best. And that uncertainty volume is really an expression of how poorly, really, we're doing, meaning that the larger that volume is, the more error there is in our guesses about where the robot's going to be. If we could predict perfectly, there would be no uncertainty volume. There would be just a point. The robot will be exactly here. So I think the answer would be, I think we do it adequately well to make this mode of operations reasonable, but there is much more room for improvement.
Well, like, for example, would if the wheel slipped on a rock or something, would that add to the uncertainty, something like that?
Absolutely, yeah.
Okay.
So wheels slipping in soft soil, falling off of a rock, things like that. Now, we have measures on the Mars rovers, for instance, that we can use to counteract that. One of them is called visual odometry. So when we have this capability running on the robots, they can keep track of how things are moving past them in the environment visually. So the challenge is that if you're only using the rover's inertial measurement and its the turning of its wheels, there's a lot of drift, is what we would call it. There's a lot of error that builds up over time. Something like visual odometry reduces but doesn't eliminate that error. And also, visual odometry at times can be expensive to run. It's a computationally intensive task on the robot, so we don't always use it. We usually use it when we expect slip to be very high.
Thank you.
Sure.
Hello. Was the dispute resolved between Gene Dogoff and Gene Rotterdam regarding the control panel in the Starship Enterprise when Rotterdam said, well, he couldn't really get his mind and the human brain around this immersion?
I really wish I could speak on that with authority. Although I'm a fan of the show, I can't say that I remember that specific episode or that specific question. I'm so sorry.
Thank you.
Could you clarify a little bit on how you plan on incorporating the two technologies with like the movement prediction and also the Oculus Rift stuff?
Sure, yeah. So when you consider that observing the environment and understanding the environment is really just sort of part one of the challenge. We also need to affect things in that environment. You can imagine that the second half of the talk is sort of the observation and understanding part, and then the first half of the talk is then how you then begin to move and affect. So you could imagine, donning a system like this, or standing inside a theater, a holodeck-like theater, planning where you want to go, and then using the time delay mitigation strategies that I discussed at the beginning to improve the efficiency of what you're accomplishing there. So for instance, being able to direct it where to drive and then stay ahead of it such that you're not wasting a lot of time on Mars.
I see. Would you simulate like Earth, like a fake environment for the person to see and then observe and then make decisions that way?
Well, you can fake some things. So for instance, like I showed with Pitfall Harry, right? And also with the committed state of the robot, you would certainly want to show them your best guess about where the robot's going to end up if you send those commands. And I think also it's of value to show them that extra state, the committed state of where it would be if you stopped right this moment. So you certainly want to fake those things. I think that there's a trade-off when you fake more, that basically you're trading the efficiencies that you gain from being able to get a little glimpse of what might be coming with the risks that you're taking if you're wrong. And so I would say you should predict as much as you possibly can, as long as you can simultaneously communicate the uncertainty you have in those predictions, so that people don't start believing something that was only a guess.
Okay, thank you.
Mm-hmm. Sure.
So the fully immersive stuff is cool, but up until that point, it seems like there's a first step, which is just generating that sort of full 3D environment, a prediction of it about the rover. How close are we to being able to do that for mission planning? Never mind the head-mounted displays, but just first-person shooter style controls.
So the 3D environment?
Yeah.
Okay. Well, first of all, let's talk about the sensors that we have on our robots to feed such an environment. So, the Mars rovers, for example, have on them a set of cameras on the mast, which points in different directions. And it's those images that we're using to render the environment that you saw, the one where we were tracking the head position. So the navigation camera pictures were actually what we were showing there. We're not even actually showing the highest resolution data that Curiosity can acquire, which is with the mass cam. We were just using the navigation images, which are good, but lower resolution. So I think we are in a good place there. There are whole parts of JPL who have really, I think, mastered the technique of taking images that are acquired in stereo, so 2 images, and extracting range data from it, and then converting that into a terrain model like the one that you were seeing there. Now, one challenge is then effective rendering of that. So I'll go just a little bit more into depth about some of the tricks we've been playing there. We had actually a student who worked with us this summer, Charlie Goddard, who did some work in this area. And we're actually blending, and I'll go back to that video so you can see a little bit of evidence of it. Okay, so let me just pause it right here. Okay, that's a little hard to see, but there's actually a couple kinds of data being shown here. Up near the top are 2-dimensional images that are being, so when the rover takes its pictures, of course, it's just taking pictures, like photographs. We try to use those pictures as long as we can, because the detail that a picture offers is very, very high. And as long as you're looking at the scene from the same point of view as the picture, you can get a great deal of information from the photograph. The problem is when your head moves away from where that picture was taken, because that's when the image no longer really makes sense. Now, one thing that Charlie worked on this summer was a way to use a technique we were calling disparity mapping to take pixels from that image, project it through the model of the camera that we have, and shift them as your head moves. And so what that allows us to do is to hang on to those images just a little bit longer. So if I move my head to the side, we can still show basically the right thing on that image. And if we go a little bit further, we have to give up on the image. And we give up in favor of what you see in the foreground of this video. And that is all point cloud data. So point cloud data is then taking those images, which give us information about how far away things are in the environment, and rendering a mesh. You can think of it as a bunch of dots connected together that give you the feeling that it's a continuous scene. We're actually using a technique here called surflet rendering, which another one of our students, Dylan, worked on this summer. And the interesting thing about surflet rendering is that it's a little more data efficient than other methods that have been used. So what we're looking for actually is a great combination of all these rendering techniques all used at the same time to give you the most complete scene that we can. So I would say this is close to as good as we can do it right now. We hope to get further than this. The next opportunity, so the next frontier, would be thinking about new instruments that could be put on a future mission that are designed to build environments like these. So not piecing together from images necessarily, but what other kinds of instruments, LiDAR-based instruments, things like that, that could build up 3D scenes.
Is most of the image data you get from Curiosity usable for something like this, or is it something you can only do with the sort of stereo panoramas that you get here?
Really only the stereo panoramas, because we need the stereo information to help us understand how far away things are in the scene. In some cases, monoscopic, just one eye image is useful. Another challenge is, like right now, like we're only using one camera here. We're using a pair of cameras, but one type of camera on Curiosity. Another interesting challenge is integrating the other imaging sensors like the mass cam or the hazard cameras, which are actually mounted on the body of the vehicle, possibly even the camera that is on the arm, the MOLLE, or the microscope, basically. Those all could produce useful data in certain cases that could help fill out this model.
Thanks.
Sure.
Hi, a couple of us were talking at lunch about your talk. We're excited to come, and my friend asked me a question. When we're all standing there on Mars, given the latency, how will we know what we're going to say to one another, or how will we interact with each other? We were wondering, could you build in some kind of predictive modeling of how I might react to you, and use some of the same techniques to convince this poor astronaut that may have been out there for 500 days, or however long we're going to send him out, that maybe he's not alone in the universe, but that he has friends with him in a way that's a little bit more instinctive than 25-minute delay on how are you doing?
It's funny. I don't think it's so far-fetched. So it kind of falls in that category of us all desperately wanting to believe that we're more complicated than we are. But if you look at, for instance, something as simple as predictive texting, when you start typing on your phone and it starts completing the words for you, there is a lot of predictability, it turns out, in I think the way that humans behave. I think there's a limit. We wouldn't be able to push that too terribly far. I think predicting the directions that people are going, the ways that they're going to interact with objects in the environment, things like that seem like low-hanging fruit. Conversations, more difficult. I hope I would not be so easily predicted that someone could play out my conversation before I said it. Only my wife can do that. Yes?
Yeah, in the beginning you showed these different scenarios with like relay satellite in the Martian orbit, but right now we don't have that one. Can you anyhow already gain some efficiencies, or can you already use this technology with this 24-hour time frame communications?
It's a good question. I would say that the operations process that we've developed for controlling robots on Mars today is very well suited to the amount of time delay that we're dealing with, and with that cadence of operations where we're uplinking really at most once a day, often at times once every 3 days in certain cases. We do have orbiters around Mars, of course, and they are relaying almost all of the data that comes back from the assets that are on the surface. It's that there are too few, and they have other jobs. These orbiters are still performing scientific missions of their own, so they can't spend all their time just relaying telemetry for us. There have been proposals of, for instance, a Mars telecom orbiter that was, a few years back, to put an asset around Mars that would provide dedicated telemetry. I don't think we have to have that to start making progress in this direction, but it would require some pretty creative thinking about how to increase the frequency of communication with the robots. Another challenge, by the way, is that communication is expensive in terms of power by the robot on the surface. So we also need to think about power systems that can support more frequent communication by a robot on Mars.
All right, thanks.
Sure. Oh, Mark's bringing here a couple questions that were typed in on Ustream. So, the first one says, can we use this technology to fly an airplane on Mars? And I would say, absolutely. Actually, the first thing that makes me think of is a Titan airship, actually, one of my favorite ideas that has been floated around JPL in the past. But focusing on Mars for a second, you're not going to control, a dogfighter, right? Banking and turning and looping, and that's obviously not something you want to do with 5 to 20 minutes of time delay. However, if your airplane is really a robot, which it would absolutely have to be, then what it should be accomplishing is all of that high frequency control itself. So it's reacting to the buffeting winds, and it's keeping itself level, and what you're giving it are longer range trajectories. For instance, I want to start reducing my altitude now and coming closer to this mountain, or I want to climb now, or I want to head over this way. And so you can imagine, when we were plotting out those paths using our little robot in the lab, there's nothing about this approach that doesn't scale to controlling something in 3 dimensions. When you're plotting out a path on the ground there, you can just imagine also plotting a path through the air. It's just that you're more supervising the flight than you are actively controlling and joysticking the plane. So the second question says, is NASA partnered with any gaming companies to aid with exploration? And the answer is an emphatic yes. So we have a number of partnerships in my lab, the Ops Lab, with a variety of partners. And you've seen some of the examples of those partnerships today. There are others. I'll mention just briefly something that I wish I could have squeezed into the talk today, but couldn't for time, was that we actually released NASA's first game to a video gaming console 1 year ago. It was called Mars Rover Landing, and we released it with Microsoft to the Xbox 360. And with it, people could land on Mars using the Kinect in their living room. And it was actually really a phenomenal success. And I think those things absolutely aid with exploration. First of all, it explains to people what we're trying to accomplish, but I think also connects them in a way that other media doesn't. One thing I'm really fond of mentioning often is that 97% of American teenagers play video games. 97%. This is the Pew Research Center study of 2008 called Teens, Video Games, and Civics. So that's in 2008, 97% of them played, which, let's just face it, that's just all, right? That's all teenagers play video games. How many people in this room remember watching the Apollo landing in their living room? A lot of hands. And I know from talking to a lot of people about it that a lot of people who work with me trace their inspiration moment, the moment that made them want to go work for NASA, to that living room, to that moment. There's something very special about experiencing something like that with your family in your living room. And video games are in the living room. So I see it as a great way for NASA to be back there and again in the future. So yes, emphatically, we are partnered with video game companies, and I really dearly hope that we will see even more of that in the future. Are there any final questions? I'm happy to, if you've got more on your minds, come and find me afterwards. But I see we're a little over time now, so I'll conclude.